The moment my daughter-in-law Vanessa deliberately turned the water temperature to scalding and said, "Oops, sorry, Margaret. I guess you'll just have to be more careful next time," I knew our relationship had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. What she didn't know was that by the time she finished smirking at my burned skin, I had already decided she was about to learn exactly what real hardship looked like, and I had the resources to teach her that lesson in ways she'd never forget. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The accident that changed everything happened on a crisp October morning in 2023, 3 months after I'd moved into what my son Daniel insisted was a temporary arrangement, while I recovered from the hip replacement surgery that had left me dependent on others for the most basic human needs. At 73, I had never imagined I'd be reduced to requiring assistance with bathing, dressing, and navigating the stairs of what had once been my own domain. But age and arthritis had conspired to humble me in ways I was still learning to accept. Daniel had been so concerned, so attentive during those first weeks after surgery, calling daily from his law firm downtown, arranging for physical therapy, ensuring I had everything I needed for a complete recovery. His wife Vanessa had seemed equally supportive initially, offering to help with meal preparation, light housekeeping, and the more intimate aspects of personal care that made me cringe with embarrassment, but which she handled with what appeared to be genuine compassion and professionalism. Vanessa worked as a nurse at Riverside General Hospital, a job that had supposedly prepared her for the realities of caring for elderly patients, though I was beginning to suspect that her bedside manner at work was considerably different from what I experienced in the privacy of their suburban colonial home. She was 38 years old, blonde and meticulously put together in the way that suggested both vanity and insecurity, always dressed as if she were expecting to run into someone important at the grocery store or school pickup line. The house itself was a monument to their success, or at least their desire to appear successful. Located in Meadowbrook Estates, one of those manufactured neighborhoods where every home looked like a slight variation on the same architectural theme, it boasted granite countertops, hardwood floors, and a kitchen island large enough to land a small aircraft. Daniel and Vanessa had purchased it 5 years earlier, stretching their budget to its absolute limit, because Vanessa had insisted they needed to live somewhere that reflected Daniel's position at the law firm and her own aspirations for their social standing. Their 2 children, Emma and Lucas, were 12 and 10 respectively, bright kids who had inherited their father's thoughtful nature, but who seemed increasingly influenced by their mother's materialistic worldview and casual cruelty toward anyone she perceived as beneath her social status. I watched them during family dinners, noticed how they rolled their eyes when I asked them to repeat something I hadn't heard clearly, how they seemed embarrassed by my slower movements and occasional confusion about their various activities and schedules. The morning of the scalding incident began like any other during my stay with them. I woke around 6:30, earlier than I preferred but unable to sleep past the sounds of Vanessa moving through her elaborate morning routine, which involved 45 minutes of bathroom time, another 30 minutes selecting an outfit that projected the right combination of professional competence and effortless style, and at least 15 minutes applying makeup with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a complex procedure. Daniel had already left for the office, as he did every morning by 7:15, traveling downtown to the mid-sized firm where he specialized in corporate law and worked the kind of hours that paid for houses in Meadowbrook Estates, but left little time for noticing the subtle dynamics playing out in his own home. He was a good man, my son, but he had inherited his father's tendency to trust people's stated intentions rather than observing their actual behavior, a trait that had served him well in his professional life but made him vulnerable to manipulation in his personal relationships. I had been living with Daniel and Vanessa for just over 2 months by then, long enough to recognize the patterns that govern their household, but not long enough to feel comfortable asserting myself, when those patterns became uncomfortable or problematic. Vanessa had established herself as the unquestioned authority on all matters domestic, from meal planning to housekeeping schedules to the protocols surrounding my care, and she had made it clear through countless small gestures and comments that my presence in her home was a temporary inconvenience she was tolerating out of duty rather than affection. The bathroom where the incident occurred was the guest bathroom on the first floor, a small but well-appointed space that Vanessa had designated as mine for the duration of my stay. It featured a walk-in shower with grab bars that Daniel had installed after my surgery, non-slip mats that were supposedly designed to prevent falls, and a small bench where I could sit while washing myself, with the modified reaching tools that physical therapy had taught me to use. Vanessa had taken over the responsibility for helping me bathe 3 times a week, a task that involved adjusting the water temperature, helping me in and out of the shower, and ensuring I didn't slip or fall while maneuvering around the various safety equipment that had transformed a simple shower into something resembling a medical procedure. She approached this duty with the same clinical efficiency she brought to her hospital work, treating me more like a patient than a family member, but I had been grateful for her assistance nonetheless. That particular morning, I had woken with more stiffness than usual, the kind of deep ache in my joints that cold weather brought, and that made every movement feel deliberate and careful. I had mentioned this to Vanessa during breakfast, explaining that I might need a bit more time and assistance than usual, and she had responded with the kind of tight smile that suggested patience wearing thin, but an unwillingness to voice any actual complaints. The children had been unusually difficult during their morning routine, with Emma complaining about a school project she had forgotten about until the last minute, and Lucas refusing to wear the sweater Vanessa had selected for him because it made him look like a baby. Vanessa had handled their resistance with sharp words and barely controlled frustration, snapping at Emma to figure out her own organizational problems and physically forcing Lucas into the sweater while he protested and struggled. By the time we made it to the bathroom for my shower, Vanessa's mood had deteriorated considerably, though she maintained the facade of helpful concern that she performed whenever Daniel might be within earshot. She helped me undress with efficient movements that managed to convey both assistance and impatience, folding my clothes with more force than necessary and placing them on the counter with the kind of precision that suggested controlled anger. The shower itself began normally enough. Vanessa adjusted the water temperature to what felt like a comfortable warmth, helped me onto the shower bench, and handed me the soap and washcloth with instructions to call her when I was ready to wash my hair. She stepped outside the shower area but remained in the bathroom, ostensibly to ensure my safety but actually to scroll through her phone with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was dealing with something more interesting than elderly care. I had been washing for perhaps 10 minutes when I called for her assistance with shampooing, a task that required someone else's help, because the angle and pressure needed to properly rinse soap from my hair was beyond what my post-surgical range of motion could accommodate. Vanessa approached the shower with visible reluctance, setting her phone aside with an exaggerated sigh that made her feelings about the interruption perfectly clear. She reached for the handheld shower head, which had been designed specifically for situations like this, and began the process of wetting my hair with water that felt appropriately warm against my scalp. I closed my eyes and tried to relax into the sensation, grateful for the help despite Vanessa's obvious impatience, focusing on the simple pleasure of feeling clean and cared for even under less than ideal circumstances. The change in water temperature happened so suddenly and dramatically that my first response was pure shock rather than pain. The warm water that had been gently flowing over my head suddenly became scalding hot, hot enough to make me gasp and instinctively try to move away from the spray, a movement that was both impossible given my seated position and dangerous given my limited mobility and the slippery shower environment. The pain that followed the shock was immediate and intense, the kind of burning sensation that penetrates skin and continues to build even after the initial contact has ended. I cried out involuntarily, a sound that was part surprise and part genuine distress, and I reached up instinctively to protect my scalp from the continuing stream of water that felt like liquid fire against my already sensitive skin. Vanessa's response to my obvious distress was what transformed a potentially accidental incident into something far more sinister and deliberate. Instead of immediately adjusting the water temperature or expressing concern about my well-being, she continued to direct the scalding spray toward my head and shoulders for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few additional seconds, long enough for the initial burns to deepen and for me to understand that this was not an accident. When she finally did move to adjust the temperature, her movements were leisurely and deliberate, as if she were savoring my discomfort rather than rushing to alleviate it. She watched my face as I struggled to process what had just happened, and I saw something in her expression that made my blood run cold, despite the burning sensation spreading across my scalp and neck. "Oops," she said finally, her voice carrying none of the alarm or remorse that should have accompanied such a statement. "Sorry, Margaret, I guess you'll just have to be more careful next time." The words themselves were an apology, technically speaking, but the tone in which they were delivered made it clear that she was anything but sorry. There was satisfaction in her voice, a kind of pleased malice that suggested this incident had been deliberately orchestrated rather than accidentally caused. She was blaming me for being scalded, suggesting that somehow my need for assistance had caused the problem, rather than her deliberate manipulation of the water temperature. I sat in that shower, water now flowing at a more reasonable temperature, but my skin still burning from the assault it had just endured, and I understood with perfect clarity that Vanessa had just crossed a line from casual cruelty into active abuse. This hadn't been an accident or a moment of carelessness or even an expression of temporary frustration. This had been a deliberate act of violence against someone she perceived as vulnerable and defenseless. The physical pain was significant, certainly, but the emotional impact was far more devastating. I had been living in this house for months, trusting this woman with my most vulnerable moments, believing that despite her obvious impatience and occasional sharp words, she would never actually harm me. I had convinced myself that her coldness was simply a personality quirk, that her efficiency was preferable to false warmth, that her clinical approach to my care was actually more respectful than unwanted intimacy. Now I understood that I had been living with someone who viewed me not as a family member or even as a fellow human being deserving of basic respect, but as an inconvenience to be tolerated and, when the mood struck her, punished for the audacity of needing help. The scalding water had been a message, a demonstration of power, a reminder that I was completely dependent on her goodwill, and that she could withdraw that goodwill whenever she chose. Vanessa finished rinsing my hair with water that was now almost aggressively cool, as if to emphasize the contrast with what had come before, and she helped me out of the shower with the same efficient movement she had used to help me in. She handed me a towel and stood back while I dried myself, making no effort to check the extent of the burns or offer any kind of medical attention, despite her professional training and obvious awareness that significant damage had been done.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The skin on my scalp and the back of my neck was red and painful to the touch, with what looked like the beginning of blistering in several spots where the water had been hottest and the contact most prolonged. I could feel the heat radiating from the burned areas, and I knew from experience that this type of injury would continue to worsen over the next several hours before it began to heal. "You should probably put some aloe on that," Vanessa said as she watched me gingerly touch the injured areas. "Burns can get infected if you don't take care of them properly." Again, the words were technically helpful, but the tone was dismissive and slightly mocking, as if she were commenting on a minor scrape, rather than burns she had deliberately inflicted. She was offering medical advice while simultaneously making it clear that she had no intention of providing medical care, delegating even the treatment of injuries she had caused to my own inadequate resources. I looked at her standing there in her perfectly coordinated outfit, hair styled with professional precision, makeup applied with magazine-worthy skill, and I felt something shift inside me that had nothing to do with physical pain, and everything to do with a kind of clarity I hadn't experienced in years. Vanessa thought she was dealing with a helpless old woman, someone whose dependence on her family's charity made her vulnerable to whatever treatment they chose to provide. What Vanessa didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my apparent dependence was largely a choice rather than a necessity, that my modest lifestyle and willingness to accept help was based on love and trust rather than actual need. What she definitely didn't know was that the woman she had just deliberately burned was worth approximately $14 million, owned property in 3 states, and had spent the last 30 years building a network of business relationships and financial resources that could reshape her comfortable suburban life in ways she had never imagined. I had built my wealth slowly and quietly over decades of careful investing, strategic real estate purchases, and a small technology consulting business that I had sold for considerably more money than my family ever suspected. My late husband Robert had known about some of my financial success, but even he had never understood the full extent of what I had accumulated through careful planning and aggressive growth strategies that had paid off beyond my wildest expectations. After Robert's death 5 years earlier, I had continued to live modestly in our small ranch house, driving the same reliable Honda I had owned for 8 years, shopping at discount stores, and maintaining the lifestyle of someone living comfortably but carefully on Social Security and modest savings. My children assumed that Robert's life insurance and our small nest egg provided enough for me to get by without being a burden on them, and I had never corrected that assumption. The truth was that I could have purchased Daniel and Vanessa's house with cash, without significantly impacting my investment portfolio. I could have hired private nursing care, moved into the most luxurious assisted living facility in the state, or traveled the world in first-class comfort without ever worrying about money again. I had chosen to accept my son's offer of temporary housing because I valued family relationships and wanted to spend time with my grandchildren, not because I had no other options. Now, standing in Vanessa's guest bathroom with scalded skin and a clear understanding of how little she valued my well-being, I realized that my financial independence gave me something far more valuable than comfort or security. It gave me the power to ensure that actions had consequences, that cruelty was met with justice, and that people who chose to abuse vulnerable individuals learned exactly what vulnerability actually felt like. Vanessa had made a critical error in judgment. She had assumed that my dependence on her care made me powerless to respond to her abuse. She had calculated that an elderly woman recovering from surgery would have no choice but to accept whatever treatment she chose to provide, that complaints would be dismissed as confusion or ingratitude, that even obvious injuries could be explained away as accidents, or the inevitable result of advanced age and decreased awareness. She had miscalculated spectacularly, and I was going to make sure she understood the full extent of her mistake in ways that would reshape her understanding of power, vulnerability, and the real-world consequences of treating other human beings as disposable inconveniences. The first step in my response was to document the abuse thoroughly and professionally. I used my phone to take photographs of the burns on my scalp and neck, making sure to capture both the extent of the visible damage and the distinctive pattern that clearly indicated exposure to scalding water, rather than any kind of accidental injury. I wrote a detailed account of the incident while the memory was still fresh, including exact quotes of Vanessa's words and descriptions of her demeanor and behavior both during and after the assault. I also researched the legal definitions of elder abuse in our state, the reporting requirements for healthcare professionals who suspected such abuse, and the potential criminal and civil penalties for individuals convicted of deliberately harming elderly or disabled persons. What I discovered was both encouraging and enlightening, confirming that Vanessa's actions constituted multiple felonies, and that her status as a registered nurse actually increased, rather than decreased, the potential penalties she could face. More importantly, I began to develop a comprehensive strategy for addressing not just this specific incident but the broader pattern of disrespect and casual cruelty that I now recognized had been building over the months I had been living in their home. Vanessa had revealed her true character in that moment of deliberate violence, but I understood that this was almost certainly not an isolated incident, but rather the escalation of a mindset that viewed me as less than human and therefore deserving of whatever treatment she chose to provide. My response would be proportional but devastating, designed to teach her exactly what it felt like to be powerless and dependent on the mercy of others who might not have her best interests at heart. She was about to learn what poverty looked like, what desperation felt like, and what happened when someone with real power decided that her comfortable suburban lifestyle was no longer sustainable. The burns on my scalp took almost 2 weeks to heal completely, 2 weeks during which I endured Vanessa's continued care with perfect politeness, while planning the systematic destruction of everything she had worked to build. She never apologized for the incident, never checked on my healing progress, never acknowledged that anything unusual had happened during that shower. If anything, her treatment of me became even more dismissive and careless, as if the success of her first assault had convinced her that I was too weak or confused to retaliate in any meaningful way. Daniel remained oblivious to the undercurrents of tension in his own home, focused on a particularly demanding case that required long hours and frequent travel. When he did notice the healing burns during one of our brief conversations, Vanessa smoothly explained that I had been confused about the water temperature and had accidentally scalded myself before she could intervene. Her lie was delivered with such confidence and medical authority that Daniel accepted it without question, expressing concern for my well-being, while simultaneously suggesting that perhaps I needed more supervision during bathing to prevent future accidents. The ease with which she manipulated the narrative and turned my injury into evidence of my own incapacity was almost impressive in its audacity. Vanessa understood instinctively how to exploit the assumptions that people made about elderly women, how to frame incidents of abuse as the inevitable result of confusion or carelessness, how to position herself as the long-suffering caregiver dealing with an increasingly difficult patient. She had played this game before, I realized, possibly with other elderly patients or family members who had been unable or unwilling to challenge her version of events. The confidence with which she lied to Daniel suggested extensive practice in manipulating situations to her advantage, in presenting herself as the victim of circumstances rather than the architect of abuse. But Vanessa had never encountered someone with my resources or my particular combination of patience and strategic thinking. She was about to discover that some elderly women were considerably more dangerous than they appeared, especially when they had both the motivation and the means to ensure that justice was served, regardless of what official channels might or might not be available. The first phase of my response began with a single phone call to my financial advisor, a woman named Catherine Torres, who had been managing my investment portfolio for almost a decade, and who understood that my instructions were to be followed precisely and without questions or suggestions about alternative approaches. Catherine had helped me through the complexities of building wealth while maintaining the appearance of modest means, and she had learned to trust my judgment about when and how to deploy financial resources for maximum impact. "Catherine," I said when she answered my call, "I need you to help me teach someone about the consequences of elder abuse, and I want to make sure the lesson is both thorough and memorable." Catherine's response was immediate and professional, as I had come to expect from someone who had helped me navigate complex financial strategies for years without ever questioning my motivations or methods. She understood that my requests were always carefully considered, and that my instructions were to be followed precisely, regardless of how unconventional they might appear to someone less familiar with my particular approach to problem solving. "What kind of timeline are we looking at, Margaret?" she asked, and I could hear the subtle shift in her tone that indicated she was already mentally shifting into the mode she reserved for what she called my special projects, situations where my financial resources were deployed for purposes that went beyond traditional investment strategies. "I want everything in place within 30 days, I told her, and I want the impact to be both immediate and comprehensive. This isn't about teaching a small lesson or making a minor point. This is about fundamentally altering someone's understanding of power dynamics and ensuring they experience genuine vulnerability for the first time in their privileged life." Catherine had been handling my finances long enough to understand that when I spoke in those terms, I was preparing to deploy resources in ways that would have lasting consequences for the people involved. She had helped me through similar situations before, though none quite as personal or as deliberately targeted as what I was contemplating now. "I'll need some specific information about the targets," she said, already moving into planning mode. "Financial profiles, employment details, current debt structures, anything that might give us leverage or vulnerability points we can exploit." Over the next hour, I provided Catherine with everything I had learned about Daniel and Vanessa's financial situation during my months of living in their home. Information I had gathered, not through deliberate spying, but simply through the inevitable exposure to household discussions and decisions that came with sharing living space. What I had discovered was both illuminating and useful for my current purposes. Daniel and Vanessa were living significantly beyond their means, maintaining a lifestyle that required every penny of their combined income and left them with virtually no financial cushion for emergencies or unexpected expenses. Daniel's salary at the law firm was substantial by most standards, but it was stretched thin by the mortgage on their overpriced house, car payments on 2 luxury vehicles, private school tuition for both children, and Vanessa's expensive tastes in clothing, beauty treatments, and home decor. Vanessa's nursing salary provided additional income, but it was largely consumed by what she called professional expenses, which seemed to include an extensive wardrobe of designer scrubs, expensive cosmetics and hair treatments, and frequent spa visits that she claimed were necessary for maintaining the appearance expected of someone in her position. She had convinced Daniel that these expenses were investments in her career advancement, though I had seen no evidence that her professional status or income had improved significantly despite her considerable spending on image management. More importantly for my purposes, they were heavily leveraged in ways that made them vulnerable to even relatively minor financial disruptions. Their mortgage was an adjustable-rate loan that would reset to a significantly higher interest rate within the next 18 months, a decision they had made to qualify for a larger loan amount when interest rates were lower, but which now posed a serious threat to their ability to maintain their current housing costs. Both of their cars were leased rather than owned, with payments that consumed a substantial portion of their monthly budget, and which would require either lease renewals at higher rates or large balloon payments if they chose to purchase the vehicles at the end of their current terms. They had also accumulated significant credit card debt, mostly related to home improvements and vacation expenses that Vanessa had insisted were necessary for maintaining their social standing, but which had pushed their debt-to-income ratio into dangerous territory. Perhaps most tellingly, they had virtually no emergency savings despite their substantial combined income, a situation that reflected both their expensive lifestyle and their complete confidence that their current financial situation would continue indefinitely without disruption. They lived as if Daniel's partnership track at the law firm was guaranteed, as if Vanessa's nursing position was completely secure, as if the various financial obligations they had undertaken would never come due simultaneously or at an inconvenient time. This combination of high expenses, significant debt, and minimal savings created exactly the kind of vulnerability that could be exploited by someone with the resources and motivation to apply strategic pressure at multiple points simultaneously. Vanessa had made the mistake of abusing someone who not only had the means to retaliate, but who also possessed detailed knowledge of her family's financial weaknesses and the patience to develop a comprehensive response strategy. Catherine and I spent the following week developing what she called a multi-vector approach to destabilizing Daniel and Vanessa's financial security while ensuring that my involvement remained completely invisible until I chose to reveal it. The strategy involved several simultaneous actions designed to create maximum disruption, with minimum possibility of being traced back to me directly. The first component focused on Daniel's employment situation at Henderson Morrison & Associates, the mid-sized law firm where he had worked for 7 years, and where he was currently being considered for partnership. What Daniel didn't know, and what I had learned through my own research, was that the firm was facing significant financial pressures due to the loss of several major clients, and was actively looking for ways to reduce expenses without damaging their reputation or losing their most valuable attorneys. Catherine's business intelligence contacts had confirmed that the firm was particularly vulnerable to pressure from clients who might threaten to take their business elsewhere, especially clients who represented significant billable hours or prestigious associations. Through a series of carefully orchestrated communications that appeared to come from legitimate business concerns, we began applying pressure that would make Daniel's position at the firm considerably less secure than he currently believed. The second component targeted Vanessa's employment at Riverside General Hospital, where her nursing license and professional reputation represented not just her current income, but her entire career foundation. What Vanessa had forgotten, in her confidence that elder abuse could be covered up or dismissed, was that healthcare professionals were held to significantly higher standards of conduct than ordinary citizens, and that accusations of patient abuse could end careers even when criminal charges were not filed. Through Catherine's network of professional contacts, we initiated a formal complaint process that would trigger a comprehensive investigation into Vanessa's conduct both at the hospital and in her private life. The complaint was filed by what appeared to be a concerned colleague who had noticed patterns of behavior that suggested possible abuse of vulnerable patients, supported by anonymous reports from multiple sources that painted a picture of someone whose professional demeanor masked a troubling disregard for patient welfare. The third component involved applying direct financial pressure through strategic manipulation of their existing debt obligations and credit arrangements. Catherine's contacts in the banking industry were able to trigger reviews of their mortgage terms, credit card limits, and lease agreements that would either result in immediate cost increases or demands for additional collateral that they were unlikely to be able to provide. What made this approach particularly effective was that all of these actions would appear to be unrelated coincidences rather than coordinated attacks, creating a sense of mounting financial pressure that would seem like a series of unfortunate events rather than deliberate sabotage. Daniel and Vanessa would find themselves dealing with multiple crises simultaneously without ever suspecting that they were all connected or that someone was orchestrating their financial destruction. The beauty of this strategy was that it exploited vulnerabilities they had created themselves through their poor financial planning and overextended lifestyle. I wasn't manufacturing problems for them so much as I was ensuring that the problems they had been ignoring or minimizing would all demand attention at the same time, creating a cascade of consequences that would overwhelm their ability to manage or recover. Within 10 days of implementing our strategy, the pressure began to manifest in ways that I could observe from my position as a house guest, who appeared to be focused primarily on my own recovery and rehabilitation. Daniel began receiving phone calls that clearly agitated him, conversations that he tried to conduct privately but which I could hear through the thin walls of their efficiently constructed suburban home. The first crisis emerged when Daniel's largest client, a regional manufacturing company that had provided almost 30% of his billable hours for the past 3 years, suddenly announced that they were reviewing their legal representation and considering moving their business to a larger firm with more specialized expertise in their industry. The client expressed concerns about whether Daniel's current firm had the resources and depth to handle their expanding legal needs, concerns that had been carefully planted by Catherine's contacts but which sounded like legitimate business considerations. Daniel was devastated by this development, both because of the immediate financial impact and because the loss of such a significant client would seriously damage his prospects for partnership at the firm. He spent hours on the phone trying to reassure the client and address their concerns, but the seed of doubt had been planted by people who understood exactly how to make their worries sound reasonable and insurmountable. Simultaneously, Vanessa began dealing with complications at the hospital that started as minor administrative issues but quickly escalated into serious professional challenges. She received a formal notification that her employment was under review due to concerns raised about her patient care practices, concerns that would require a comprehensive investigation and possible disciplinary action. The investigation would examine not only her current performance but also her entire employment history, looking for patterns of behavior that might indicate problems with patient care or professional conduct. Vanessa was required to meet with hospital administrators, submit to interviews with ethics committees, and provide detailed explanations for any patient complaints or incidents that had occurred during her tenure. What made this particularly stressful for Vanessa was that she couldn't identify the source of the complaints or understand what specific incidents had triggered the investigation. The charges were serious enough to potentially affect her nursing license, but vague enough that she couldn't develop an effective defense strategy, leaving her in a state of constant anxiety about both her current employment and her future career prospects. The financial pressures began manifesting almost simultaneously with the employment issues, creating a perfect storm of stress that neither Daniel nor Vanessa was equipped to handle effectively. Their mortgage company initiated a review of their loan terms due to what they called, quote, changes in market conditions and borrower risk assessment, a review that would likely result in immediate increases to their monthly payments or demands for additional equity investments. Their credit card companies began reducing their available credit limits and increasing their interest rates, citing, quote, routine account reviews that had identified increased risk factors associated with their spending patterns and debt-to-income ratios. These changes didn't just affect their monthly payments, but also their ability to manage cash flow emergencies or unexpected expenses. Most devastating of all, both of their car leases came under scrutiny when the leasing companies received information suggesting that the lessees might be experiencing financial difficulties that could affect their ability to meet their payment obligations. This triggered clauses in their lease agreements that allowed for immediate renegotiation of terms or, in extreme cases, repossession of the vehicles if adequate financial guarantees couldn't be provided. Within 3 weeks of Catherine's initial actions, Daniel and Vanessa found themselves facing a financial crisis that threatened every aspect of their carefully constructed suburban lifestyle. They were looking at potential job losses, increased housing costs, reduced credit availability, and possible loss of their vehicles, all while trying to maintain appearances for their children and their social circle. The stress of managing these multiple crises began affecting their relationship with each other and their treatment of everyone around them, including their children and, more significantly for my purposes, me. Vanessa's already limited patience for caregiving responsibilities disappeared entirely as she became consumed with her own problems, and her treatment of me shifted from casual cruelty to active neglect. She began skipping scheduled assistance with bathing and dressing, leaving me to manage these tasks alone despite my continued limitations from surgery. She stopped preparing the meals that had been part of our arrangement, instead leaving me to fend for myself, or rely on delivery services that I was expected to pay for myself. Most tellingly, she began making comments about how my continued presence in their home was adding to their stress, and how perhaps it was time for me to make alternative arrangements for my care. Daniel was too overwhelmed with his own professional and financial crises to notice the deterioration in his wife's treatment of me, but he did begin expressing frustration about the additional expenses associated with my care, and the inconvenience of having an elderly person in the house when they were dealing with so many other problems. For the first time since I had moved in with them, I heard him questioning whether having me live with them had been the right decision. These conversations were exactly what I had been hoping to provoke. Clear evidence that their concern for my well-being was entirely dependent on their own comfort and financial security. When their lives were running smoothly, they could afford to be generous and accommodating toward an elderly family member who needed temporary assistance. When they faced challenges of their own, their first instinct was to eliminate any obligations or expenses that weren't directly beneficial to them. Vanessa's escalating hostility toward me reached a new level when she began openly questioning the extent of my injuries and limitations, suggesting that I was deliberately exaggerating my needs to avoid returning to independent living. She started making comments about elderly people who became too comfortable being taken care of and who forgot how to take care of themselves when family members were too generous with their assistance. These accusations were particularly rich coming from someone who had deliberately injured me, and who was now facing the consequences of her own poor financial planning and abusive behavior. Vanessa was projecting her own character flaws onto me, assuming that my acceptance of their help was motivated by the same selfishness and entitlement that characterized her own approach to relationships. More significantly, her comments revealed that she had no understanding of my actual financial situation or capabilities, that she genuinely believed I was a burden who would be unable to manage independently without their continued support. This misconception was about to become extremely expensive for her, both literally and figuratively. The turning point came during a particularly heated argument between Daniel and Vanessa about their mounting financial problems. An argument that took place in their kitchen while they assumed I was napping in my room, but which I could hear clearly through the house's thin interior walls. Vanessa was blaming Daniel for their situation, claiming that his failure to secure the partnership he had been promised was the root of all their current problems. "Maybe if you were better at your job, we wouldn't be in this mess," she said, her voice sharp with frustration and fear. "I work just as hard as you do, but I don't have rich clients threatening to leave because they don't think I'm good enough at what I do." Daniel's response was equally harsh, pointing out that Vanessa's own job was currently under investigation and that her spending habits had contributed significantly to their financial vulnerability. "You spend more on clothes and beauty treatments in a month than most people spend on groceries," he said. "Maybe if you lived within our means instead of trying to impress people who don't care about us, we'd have some savings to fall back on." The argument escalated from there, with each of them blaming the other for decisions they had made together and problems they had created jointly through years of poor financial planning and unrealistic lifestyle expectations. What struck me most about their fight was how quickly they turned from a united couple facing external challenges into adversaries looking for someone to blame for their mutual failures. More importantly, for my purposes, both of them eventually turned their frustration toward me, agreeing that my presence in their home was an additional burden they couldn't afford to maintain during their current crisis. Vanessa suggested that I should move into a nursing home or assisted living facility where professionals could take care of me without adding stress to their already overwhelming situation. Daniel agreed that they needed to, quote, reconsider the arrangement, and suggested that perhaps I had recovered sufficiently from my surgery to resume independent living, regardless of whether I felt ready for that transition. They talked about me as if I were a financial obligation they could eliminate, rather than a family member who had trusted them with my care during a vulnerable period. This conversation confirmed everything I had suspected about their motivations and character, providing the final justification I needed to move forward with the most devastating phase of my response strategy. They had revealed that their willingness to help family members was entirely conditional on their own comfort and convenience, that their commitment to my welfare was secondary to their own financial interests, and that they viewed me as disposable when keeping me became inconvenient. The next morning, I called Catherine with instructions to implement the final phase of our strategy, the component that would transform their current financial stress into genuine financial catastrophe, while simultaneously revealing the full extent of my own resources and capabilities. It was time for Daniel and Vanessa to learn what real powerlessness felt like. And it was time for me to teach them that actions have consequences, regardless of whether those consequences are immediately visible. I want them to understand what poverty actually looks like, I told Catherine. Not the temporary cash flow problems they're experiencing now, but genuine financial devastation that fundamentally alters their life circumstances and forces them to confront their own vulnerability. Catherine's response was immediate and comprehensive. Within 48 hours, Daniel received notice that his largest remaining client was terminating their relationship with his firm immediately, citing concerns about the firm's financial stability and ability to provide consistent service during their current transitions. This loss, combined with the earlier client departure, reduced Daniel's billable hours by more than 60% and made his position at the firm completely unsustainable. The firm's partners called Daniel into a meeting that afternoon to inform him that his partnership track was being suspended indefinitely and that his employment would be terminated at the end of the month unless he could replace the lost business immediately. They expressed regret about the situation but explained that the firm couldn't afford to maintain attorneys who weren't generating sufficient revenue to cover their overhead costs. Simultaneously, Vanessa received notification that her nursing license was being suspended pending the outcome of the investigation into her patient care practices, and that her employment at Riverside General Hospital was terminated effective immediately. The hospital administrators explained that they couldn't risk liability associated with employing a nurse whose conduct was under investigation, regardless of the ultimate outcome of that investigation. The combination of both employment terminations happening within days of each other created an immediate and catastrophic loss of income that made all of their other financial obligations instantly impossible to meet. Without Daniel's salary or Vanessa's nursing income, they had no way to cover their mortgage payments, car leases, credit card obligations, or basic living expenses. Their mortgage company, already concerned about their financial stability, immediately initiated foreclosure proceedings when they missed their first payment. Their car leasing companies repossessed both vehicles within a week of the missed payments, leaving them without transportation and with significant financial penalties for early lease termination. Most humiliating of all, their credit card companies began calling constantly about overdue payments and threatening legal action to recover the substantial debts they had accumulated during their years of living beyond their means. The combination of lost income and accelerated debt obligations created a financial disaster that would have been difficult to recover from even under the best circumstances. Within a month of my conversation with Catherine, Daniel and Vanessa had lost their jobs, their cars, and their home, and were facing bankruptcy as their only option for managing their overwhelming debt obligations. They were forced to move into a small apartment in a significantly less desirable neighborhood, enrolling their children in public schools, and eliminating all of the luxury expenses that had previously defined their lifestyle. The speed and completeness of their financial collapse shocked everyone who knew them, including family members and friends who had envied their apparent success and material prosperity. Daniel and Vanessa themselves seemed unable to comprehend how their comfortable suburban life had disintegrated so quickly and completely, searching for explanations that didn't require them to acknowledge their own poor judgment and financial irresponsibility. Throughout this entire period, I maintained my role as the dependent elderly relative who was grateful for their assistance and concerned about being a burden during their difficult times. I expressed sympathy for their situation and offered to make alternative living arrangements to reduce their stress, suggestions that they initially rejected, but which they began considering more seriously as their circumstances became increasingly desperate. What they didn't know, and what I was preparing to reveal at exactly the right moment, was that every aspect of their financial destruction had been carefully orchestrated by someone they had dismissed as powerless and irrelevant. They were about to learn that the elderly woman they had been abusing and neglecting was not only capable of defending herself, but possessed resources that could have solved all of their problems if they had treated her with basic human decency. More importantly, they were about to discover that genuine poverty and powerlessness felt very different from the temporary financial stress they had been experiencing, and that the vulnerability they were now facing was exactly what they had attempted to impose on me through abuse and neglect. The lesson was about to become personal, comprehensive, and unforgettable. The moment I had been anticipating arrived on a cold February morning, when Vanessa knocked on my bedroom door with the kind of hesitant urgency that suggested she was about to ask for something she knew she had no right to request. 3 months had passed since their financial collapse began, and the stress had transformed her from the polished, confident woman who had once burned my scalp with deliberate cruelty into someone who looked perpetually exhausted and increasingly desperate. Her appearance had deteriorated significantly during this period, not just from the obvious financial constraints that had eliminated her expensive beauty treatments and designer clothing, but from the psychological toll of watching everything she had worked to build crumble around her. The carefully maintained facade of suburban success had been stripped away, revealing someone who had built her entire identity around material possessions and social status that could disappear overnight. "Margaret," she said, standing in my doorway with an expression that attempted to convey both humility and hope, "I was wondering if we could talk. About our situation, I mean. About some possible solutions that might help all of us get through this difficult time." I looked up from the book I had been reading, a biography of a woman who had built a business empire from nothing, and used her wealth to establish foundations that still operated decades after her death, and I saw something in Vanessa's face that I had never seen before. The recognition that she was completely powerless, and that her survival might depend on the goodwill of someone she had previously considered beneath her consideration. "Of course, dear," I said, setting my book aside and giving her my full attention. "I've been concerned about how difficult things have been for your family lately. Please, sit down and tell me what's on your mind." Vanessa perched on the edge of the chair beside my bed, her posture rigid with the kind of nervous energy that comes from preparing to ask for help from someone you've never respected. She had clearly rehearsed this conversation, probably multiple times, but her carefully planned words seemed to abandon her as she faced the reality of actually making her request. "The thing is," she began, her voice carefully controlled but with an underlying tremor that betrayed her desperation, "Daniel and I have been talking about our options, and we realize that we might need to consider some changes to our living situation. Temporary changes, of course, just until we can get back on our feet." I waited patiently for her to continue, maintaining the expression of concerned interest that I had perfected during my months of observing their family dynamics and planning my response to their treatment of me. Vanessa was clearly struggling to find a way to ask for financial assistance, without acknowledging the irony of seeking help from someone she had been abusing and neglecting. "We were wondering," she continued, her words coming faster now as if speed could somehow make the request less humiliating, "if you might know of any resources or programs that could help families in temporary financial difficulty. Maybe something through your church or community organizations. Or perhaps you might know of someone who could provide a small loan to help us through this transition period." The audacity of her request was breathtaking in its complete lack of self-awareness. Vanessa was asking me to help her find financial assistance to address problems I had deliberately created, seeking aid from the same person she had systematically mistreated, and whose resources she had never bothered to investigate or acknowledge. She was operating under the assumption that I was as powerless as she now felt, that my only value lay in whatever meager connections I might have to charitable organizations or community support systems. More tellingly, she was framing their situation as a temporary setback, rather than the consequence of years of poor financial planning and character flaws, suggesting that they deserved assistance rather than having earned their current circumstances through their own choices and behavior. She had learned nothing from their experience except that being poor was uncomfortable, and that someone else should be responsible for solving the problems they had created for themselves. "I appreciate you thinking of me as someone who might be able to help," I said carefully, watching her face for signs of genuine remorse or accountability that never materialized. "It sounds like you're facing some very serious challenges. Can you tell me more about what kind of assistance you think would be most helpful?" Vanessa's relief at my apparently sympathetic response was visible and immediate, confirming that she had expected me to either dismiss her request entirely or lecture her about the consequences of poor financial planning. She had steeled herself for rejection but had hoped for exactly the kind of enabling response that had allowed her to avoid accountability for her behavior throughout her adult life. "Well," she said, leaning forward with renewed confidence, We're looking at needing about $15,000 to catch up on some essential expenses and give us enough breathing room to find new employment opportunities. It wouldn't be a gift, of course. We'd pay back every penny with interest once we're stabilized again. $15,000. The amount was both significant enough to represent a major expense for most people and small enough to seem reasonable when compared to the magnitude of their actual financial problems. What Vanessa didn't understand was that $15,000 was less than I typically spent on charitable donations in a single month, that the amount she was describing as potentially life-changing assistance was essentially a rounding error in my monthly investment statements. More importantly, she was asking for help without acknowledging any of the behavior that had led to our current relationship dynamic, without apologizing for the abuse she had inflicted, without recognizing that her request required me to overlook months of deliberate cruelty and neglect. She was treating our conversation as a straightforward financial transaction, rather than an opportunity to address the fundamental problems in how she treated other human beings. That does sound like a reasonable plan, I said, maintaining my tone of supportive interest, while internally marveling at her complete inability to recognize the irony of her situation. Have you explored other options? Family members who might be able to help, or perhaps financial institutions that specialize in emergency lending? Vanessa's expression darkened slightly at the mention of family assistance, suggesting that she had already exhausted those possibilities and received responses that were less encouraging than what she was hoping to get from me. Daniel's family doesn't really have the resources to help with something this significant, she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge that indicated this was a painful topic. And my family, well, they think we brought these problems on ourselves through poor planning. The admission that her own family had refused to help was particularly revealing, suggesting that people who knew her well had concluded that her financial problems were self-inflicted, and that providing assistance would only enable continued poor judgment rather than addressing underlying issues. Even her closest relatives had apparently decided that she needed to face consequences for her choices rather than being rescued from them. As for banks and lending institutions, she continued, our credit situation makes traditional loans difficult to obtain right now. Most lenders want to see stable employment and income, which we obviously can't provide at the moment. This was the opening I had been waiting for, the moment when Vanessa's desperation would force her to confront the reality of her situation and potentially acknowledge the behavior that had brought us to this point. I could either continue to play the role of the sympathetic but powerless elderly relative, or I could begin revealing the true extent of my capabilities and resources. Vanessa, I said, my tone becoming slightly more serious. Before we talk about potential solutions, I think we need to address some things that have happened between us during my stay here. I want to make sure we're both being completely honest with each other about our situation and our relationship. The change in my tone and approach clearly caught her off guard, and I saw a flicker of anxiety cross her face as she realized that this conversation might not proceed in the straightforward manner she had anticipated. She had expected either sympathy or rejection, but she hadn't prepared for the possibility that I might have my own agenda or conditions for any assistance I might be able to provide. I'm not sure what you mean, she said carefully, her voice taking on the defensive quality she used when she sensed criticism or accountability approaching. I think we've always been honest with each other. Maybe not always as patient as we should have been, given the stress everyone has been under, but certainly honest. Her attempt to reframe months of abuse and neglect as occasional impatience was exactly the kind of response I had expected, a demonstration of her fundamental inability to acknowledge the severity of her behavior or take responsibility for the harm she had caused. She was minimizing and deflecting, even when her own survival might depend on facing the truth about her actions. Vanessa, I said, pulling out my phone and opening the photo gallery where I had stored the documentation of my injuries from the scalding water incident. I want to show you something, and then I want you to tell me honestly whether you think this looks like the result of an accident or impatience. I handed her the phone displaying the clear images of the burns on my scalp and neck, photographs that showed not only the extent of the damage but also the distinctive pattern that indicated deliberate exposure to scalding water rather than any kind of accidental injury. I watched her face as she looked at the evidence, seeing recognition and fear replace the confidence she had been projecting. I don't understand why you would take pictures of something like this, she said, her voice now noticeably tighter as she realized that her version of events might not be the only record of what had happened between us. Accidents happen, especially with elderly people who might be confused about temperatures or safety procedures. Even when confronted with photographic evidence of abuse, Vanessa continued to blame me for injuries she had deliberately inflicted, suggesting that my age and supposed confusion were responsible for burns that clearly resulted from her actions. She was doubling down on her lies even as she asked for my help, apparently unable to comprehend that accountability might be a prerequisite for assistance. "These aren't the only records I have," I continued, watching her expression grow increasingly alarmed as she began to understand that I had been far more aware and strategic than she had realized. "I've documented every incident of abuse and neglect that has occurred during my stay here, including detailed accounts of your deliberate actions and the explanations you gave to Daniel when he noticed my injuries." I opened another folder on my phone, showing her the comprehensive documentation I had maintained throughout my stay. Records that included not only photographs but also detailed written accounts, audio recordings of conversations, and timestamps that correlated with medical appointments and other verifiable events. The evidence was thorough, professional, and absolutely devastating to any defense she might attempt to mount. I've also researched the legal requirements for reporting elder abuse, the professional standards that apply to registered nurses who engage in such behavior, and the potential criminal and civil penalties for people who deliberately harm elderly or disabled individuals, I said, my voice remaining calm but taking on an edge of authority that clearly surprised her. Vanessa stared at the phone in her hands, scrolling through documentation that revealed not only the extent of my awareness, but also the level of strategic planning that had gone into preserving evidence of her behavior. She was beginning to understand that I was not the confused, powerless elderly woman she had assumed me to be, but someone who had been methodically building a case against her while appearing to be completely vulnerable. "Margaret," she said, her voice now openly panicked as the implications of my documentation became clear. "I think there might be some misunderstandings here. I've always tried to take good care of you, and if there were any incidents where you felt uncomfortable or unsafe, I'm sure we can work through those issues without involving outside authorities." The shift from minimizing my injuries to acknowledging that incidents had occurred represented progress of a sort, but her focus remained on avoiding consequences rather than accepting responsibility. She was offering to work through problems as if abuse were a communication issue that could be resolved through better understanding rather than a deliberate pattern of behavior that required accountability and change. "What kind of working through did you have in mind?" I asked, genuinely curious to see whether she was capable of offering anything approaching genuine remorse or accountability, or whether her response would continue to focus on her own convenience and survival. "Well," she said, clearly improvising as she tried to find a response that would minimize both her culpability and the potential consequences she now realized she might be facing. "We could establish better communication protocols for caregiving situations, maybe set up some safety procedures that would prevent any future misunderstandings about things like water temperature or assistance requirements." Even in her desperation, Vanessa was unable to acknowledge that deliberately scalding an elderly person constituted abuse rather than a misunderstanding about water temperature. She was proposing procedural solutions to what she continued to frame as accident. "That's an interesting approach," I said, setting my phone aside and looking directly at her with an expression that I hoped conveyed both disappointment and determination. "But I think we need to address some more fundamental issues before we can talk about safety procedures or assistance with your financial problems." The mention of her financial problems in the context of accountability for abuse clearly terrified her, as she began to understand that the help she desperately needed might be contingent on acknowledging behavior she had spent months denying and minimizing. She was trapped between her need for assistance and her unwillingness to accept responsibility, forced to choose between her survival and her pride. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice now openly desperate as she realized that this conversation was not going to proceed according to her expectations or desires. "What would it take for us to move past these issues and focus on solutions that could help everyone involved?" This was the question I had been waiting for, the moment when Vanessa's desperation would force her to acknowledge that I held power in our relationship and that her future might depend on my decisions rather than her manipulation or demands. She was asking what price I would set for my assistance, apparently still hoping that some form of negotiation or transaction could resolve the problems she had created through abuse and neglect. "What I want," I said, standing up from my chair and moving to the window where I could look out at their small, carefully maintained backyard, is for you to understand what it feels like to be completely powerless and dependent on someone who doesn't value your well-being or dignity. I turned back to face her, seeing confusion and fear in her expression as she tried to understand what my words meant for her immediate situation and her family's survival. You asked me about resources that might be available to help with your financial problems, and I think it's time I was completely honest with you about what resources actually exist. Vanessa leaned forward expectantly, clearly hoping that I was about to reveal connections to charitable organizations or community programs that could provide the assistance she needed. She was still operating under the assumption that my value lay in whatever modest connections I might have, rather than in resources I controlled directly. The truth is, I continued, returning to my chair and meeting her eyes directly, I don't need to help you find financial assistance because I am financial assistance. I have more than enough resources to solve your family's current problems immediately and completely, but I need you to understand why I've chosen not to do so. The confusion on Vanessa's face was complete and immediate, as if I had started speaking a foreign language rather than revealing information that recontextualized everything she thought she knew about our relationship. She stared at me blankly for several seconds before the implications of my words began to penetrate her preconceptions about elderly widows and their financial limitations. I don't understand, she said slowly, her voice reflecting the cognitive dissonance of trying to reconcile my apparent dependence and vulnerability with a claim of substantial financial resources. If you have money, why have you been living here with us? Why have you needed our help with everything? This was the moment I had been anticipating for months, the opportunity to explain that everything she thought she understood about power dynamics and vulnerability had been based on assumptions rather than reality. Vanessa had created an entire worldview around her superiority to people she perceived as weak or dependent, never considering that apparent vulnerability might mask actual strength. I've been living here because my son invited me to stay during my recovery, and because I wanted to spend time with my grandchildren and observe how my family actually treated elderly relatives when they believed those relatives had no other options, I said, watching her face as the implications of my words became clear. I needed your help with personal care because I was genuinely recovering from surgery, not because I was incapable of arranging alternative assistance if your care became inadequate or abusive. The difference is that I chose to trust you with my vulnerability, while you chose to exploit that vulnerability for your own psychological satisfaction. Vanessa was struggling visibly to process this information, her entire understanding of our relationship and her own position within it crumbling as she realized that the power dynamic she had been exploiting was completely different from what she had assumed. The elderly woman she had been abusing and dismissing was not only capable of defending herself, but had been collecting evidence and planning responses, while appearing to be completely helpless. How much money are you talking about? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she began to grasp the magnitude of what I was revealing to her. Enough to have purchased this house with cash without significantly affecting my monthly budget, I said, gesturing around the room that represented the pinnacle of Daniel and Vanessa's financial achievement. Enough to have hired private nursing care instead of depending on family assistance. Enough to have solved every financial problem your family is currently facing without requiring any significant sacrifice on my part. The number I was implying clearly staggered her, as she tried to reconcile the image of substantial wealth with the modest, dependent elderly woman she thought she had been caring for. Everything she had assumed about my limitations and vulnerabilities was being revealed as deliberate choices rather than imposed circumstances. $14 million, I said, deciding to be specific rather than leaving her to guess at amounts that might still be within her ability to comprehend or rationalize. That's my current net worth, not including real estate holdings in 3 states or the business interests that continue to generate income whether I pay attention to them or not. Vanessa's face went completely white as the full scope of my resources became clear, and I saw her mind racing as she tried to calculate the implications of what I was telling her. $14 million was more money than she had ever imagined having access to, an amount that could have solved not just their current crisis, but every financial concern they were ever likely to face. But why? She stammered, her voice breaking as she began to understand the magnitude of what her behavior had cost her family. Why didn't you help us when all of this started? Why did you let us lose everything when you could have prevented it? This was the question that revealed how completely she misunderstood both the situation and her own role in creating it. Vanessa was asking why I hadn't rescued her from consequences she had earned through her own choices, why I hadn't protected her from problems she had created through abuse and financial irresponsibility. She was still thinking in terms of entitlement, rather than accountability. Because, I said, my voice taking on the kind of firmness that I had used when my own children had needed to learn difficult lessons about consequences and responsibility, helping you would have taught you nothing about the impact of your choices on other people, and it would have enabled you to continue treating vulnerable individuals as disposable inconveniences. I stood up again and moved to the dresser, where I had placed some of the letters and documents that Catherine had helped me prepare over the past months, evidence of the systematic approach I had taken to both documenting abuse and planning appropriate responses. Your family's financial collapse wasn't a series of unfortunate coincidences, I continued, turning back to face her with papers in my hand that would explain exactly how comprehensive my response had been. Every job loss, every loan cancellation, every credit reduction, every lease termination was carefully orchestrated by people working on my behalf to ensure that you experienced genuine vulnerability and powerlessness. Vanessa's expression shifted from confusion to horror, as she realized that not only had I been aware of her abuse and capable of responding to it, but that I had been systematically destroying her family's financial security as a deliberate consequence of her behavior. Everything they had lost, every humiliation they had endured, every moment of desperation and fear, had been purposefully created by someone they had dismissed as harmless. You did this to us, she whispered, her voice reflecting a combination of disbelief and dawning terror, as she understood that the person she had been abusing possessed both the motivation and the resources to utterly destroy her life. I taught you what vulnerability feels like, I corrected, emphasizing the educational nature of what she was experiencing. I showed you what it's like to be powerless and dependent on the mercy of others who might not have your best interests at heart. I demonstrated what happens when people you trust choose to exploit your weaknesses instead of protecting you during difficult times. The papers I held contained detailed records of every action Catherine and I had taken to destabilize their financial situation, a comprehensive accounting of the strategy we had developed and implemented to ensure that Vanessa and Daniel experienced consequences proportional to their behavior. I had documented their destruction as thoroughly as I had documented their abuse. The difference between what I did to you and what you did to me, I continued, spreading some of the papers on the bed between us so she could see the extent of the planning and resources that had gone into her education, is that you abused someone who had trusted you with their vulnerability, while I simply allowed someone who had chosen to be cruel to experience the natural consequences of their choices. Vanessa stared at the papers documenting her family's systematic destruction, her mind clearly struggling to process the sophistication and thoroughness of the response. She was seeing evidence of planning and execution that revealed not only extensive financial resources but also professional expertise and strategic thinking that completely contradicted her assumptions about elderly women and their capabilities. You could have just reported me to the hospital or called the police, she said, her voice now reflecting something approaching awe at the scope of what I had accomplished. Why did you do all of this instead? This question revealed that she still didn't understand the fundamental lesson I had been trying to teach her. Vanessa was thinking in terms of punishment rather than education, assuming that my goal had been revenge, rather than ensuring that she truly understood the experience of being vulnerable and powerless. Because reporting abuse to authorities teaches you to be more careful about being caught, I explained, sitting back down and maintaining eye contact to ensure she understood the importance of what I was telling her. Experiencing genuine vulnerability teaches you to value other people's vulnerability and to protect it, rather than exploit it. I picked up one of the documents that detailed the Victim Compensation Fund Catherine and I had established to assist other elderly individuals who had experienced abuse in healthcare settings, showing Vanessa that my response had included not just consequences for her behavior, but also positive actions to help people who had suffered similar treatment. This fund has already helped 17 families who were victimized by healthcare workers who thought elderly patients were too powerless or confused to hold them accountable, I said, watching her face as she realized that her abuse had motivated me to help other people rather than simply to seek revenge. Every dollar that went into establishing this fund came from money that could have solved your family's financial problems instantly and effortlessly. The amount I've spent teaching you about consequences and helping your victims could have made you wealthy beyond your current ability to imagine. The mathematical reality of what her abuse had cost her family was clearly devastating for Vanessa to contemplate. She was understanding not just that help had been available all along, but that her behavior had actually redirected resources that could have benefited her toward helping people she had never considered or cared about. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small and defeated, as she began to understand that the power dynamic between us had been permanently altered, and that her family's future depended entirely on decisions I would make based on criteria she was only beginning to understand. This was the question I had been preparing to answer for months, the moment when I would explain what genuine accountability looked like and what changes would be required for any possibility of assistance or reconciliation. Vanessa needed to understand that moving forward required more than apologies or promises, that rebuilding trust required demonstrating actual change, rather than simply expressing regret about consequences. What happens now depends entirely on whether you're capable of learning from this experience and making fundamental changes to how you treat other people, I said, gathering the papers and returning them to their folder while she watched with obvious anxiety about what my decision might be. If you can acknowledge what you did wrong, take responsibility for the harm you caused, and demonstrate genuine commitment to treating vulnerable people with dignity and respect, then we can discuss what assistance might be appropriate to help your family recover from the consequences of your choices. I stood up and moved toward the door, pausing to look back at her as she sat in the chair looking smaller and more frightened than I had ever seen her during our months of living together. "But if you continue to minimize your behavior, blame external circumstances for your situation, or treat this conversation as a negotiation rather than an accountability session, then you'll continue to experience exactly the kind of powerlessness you inflicted on me." Vanessa started to speak, probably to offer the kind of immediate apology and promises that she hoped would quickly resolve her situation and restore her access to resources. But I held up my hand to stop her before she could begin what I was certain would be a manipulative rather than genuine response. "Don't answer now," I said, reaching for the door handle while maintaining eye contact with her. "Take time to think about what genuine accountability looks like and what changes you're actually willing to make and how you treat people who can't defend themselves. When you're ready to have that conversation honestly, we can discuss what help might be available." I left her sitting in my room with the full knowledge of both my resources and my willingness to use them, understanding finally that the elderly woman she had been abusing was not only capable of defending herself but had already demonstrated the ability to utterly destroy the life she had built through years of entitlement and poor choices. Over the following weeks, I watched Vanessa struggle with the cognitive dissonance of reconciling her previous assumptions about power and vulnerability with the reality of her situation. She had to navigate her daily life knowing that the solution to all of her family's problems was living in the same house, available immediately if she could demonstrate genuine change, but completely inaccessible if she continued to operate according to her previous patterns of manipulation and entitlement. The psychological pressure of this situation was clearly immense, as she had to confront not only the consequences of her past behavior, but also the fundamental aspects of her character that had led to that behavior. She couldn't simply apologize and move on, because I had made it clear that assistance required demonstrating actual change rather than expressing regret about being caught. Daniel, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the full dynamics between his wife and his mother, focused primarily on his own efforts to find new employment and rebuild their financial situation through conventional means. He had noticed the tension between Vanessa and me, but he attributed it to the stress of their financial crisis rather than understanding that his wife's treatment of me had actually caused that crisis. This ignorance was probably fortunate for their marriage, as the full truth about Vanessa's behavior and its consequences would likely have destroyed any possibility of their relationship surviving their current difficulties. Daniel was a fundamentally decent person who would have been horrified to learn that his wife had been abusing his mother and that this abuse had led directly to their financial destruction. 3 months after my revelation to Vanessa, she finally requested another private conversation, approaching me with an expression that suggested she had spent considerable time thinking about accountability and genuine change, rather than simply looking for ways to manipulate the situation to her advantage. "Margaret," she said, her voice carrying a quality of humility that I had never heard from her before, "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I realize that I need to acknowledge some things about my behavior that I wasn't ready to face before." I looked up from the financial statements I had been reviewing, reports from Catherine about the various charitable initiatives that my money was supporting, and the continued growth of investments that could solve problems for deserving people rather than enabling destructive behavior. "I'm listening," I said, setting the papers aside and giving her my full attention while maintaining the kind of neutral expression that would allow her to speak honestly without feeling pressured to say what she thought I wanted to hear. "I deliberately hurt you," she said, the words coming out in a rush as if she were afraid that hesitation would prevent her from speaking them at all. "The scalding water wasn't an accident, and it wasn't a moment of frustration or carelessness. I wanted to cause you pain because I resented having to take care of you, and I thought you were too weak and confused to do anything about it." This admission was more than I had expected from someone who had spent months minimizing and denying her behavior, and it represented genuine progress toward the kind of accountability that would be necessary for any possibility of rebuilding trust or considering assistance. "I treated you like you were less than human," she continued, her voice breaking as she forced herself to confront the full implications of her actions. "I used your vulnerability against you because I could, and because I thought there would never be any consequences for treating an elderly person badly." The tears that accompanied these words appeared to be genuine expressions of remorse, rather than manipulative attempts to generate sympathy, though I had learned to be cautious about accepting emotional displays from someone who had demonstrated extensive skill at deception and manipulation. "I understand now that everything that happened to our family was the result of my choices," she said, looking directly at me with an expression that reflected both shame and determination. "I know that you had the power to help us all along, and I know that my behavior prevented that help from being available when we needed it." This acknowledgement of the connection between her actions and their consequences was crucial, as it demonstrated understanding that abuse had costs beyond the immediate harm to victims, and that treating people badly had implications for relationships and future support that extended far beyond the initial incidents. "What I want to know," she continued, her voice steadying as she moved beyond confession toward a request for guidance, "is whether there's anything I can do to demonstrate that I've learned from this experience, and that I'm committed to treating people differently going forward." This was the question I had been hoping she would eventually ask, the indication that she was ready to focus on change rather than simply on avoiding consequences. Vanessa was finally asking about accountability and growth, rather than negotiating for assistance or trying to minimize the significance of her behavior. "That's exactly the right question," I said, recognizing that we had reached the point where genuine progress became possible. "The fact that you're asking about demonstrating change rather than simply apologizing suggests that you understand what real accountability requires." I stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the small backyard where her children sometimes played when they weren't overwhelmed by the stress and uncertainty that had consumed their household since their financial collapse began. "The demonstration I need from you," I said, turning back to face her with an expression that reflected both seriousness and hope, "is a commitment to using your professional expertise to help other elderly and vulnerable individuals rather than exploiting or harming them." Vanessa looked confused for a moment, clearly not understanding what specific actions I was requesting or how such a commitment would be implemented in practical terms. "I want you to work for the Victim Assistance Fund I established," I explained, retrieving the documents that detailed the charitable initiative that had grown out of my response to her abuse. "Not as an employee who receives a salary, but as a volunteer who contributes her professional skills to helping people recover from the kind of treatment you used to provide." The proposal clearly surprised her, as she had been expecting either punishment or forgiveness rather than an opportunity to transform her relationship with vulnerable populations from one of exploitation to one of genuine service. "The fund provides support services to elderly individuals who have been abused or neglected by healthcare workers," I continued, showing her materials that explained the scope and impact of the program Catherine and I had developed. "We need someone with nursing experience who understands both the medical needs of elderly patients and the psychological dynamics that make abuse possible." Vanessa examined the documents with obvious interest, reading about initiatives that included not only direct financial assistance to abuse victims but also education programs for healthcare workers and advocacy efforts aimed at improving protection for vulnerable patients. "You want me to help people who were hurt the same way I hurt you," she said, clearly understanding the symbolic and practical significance of what I was proposing. "I want you to understand what caring for vulnerable people actually looks like when it's done with respect and genuine concern for their well-being," I corrected, emphasizing the educational rather than punitive nature of the proposal. I want you to see elderly patients as human beings deserving protection, rather than as inconveniences to be managed or controlled. The offer represented both an opportunity for redemption and a test of her genuine commitment to change, as working with abuse victims would require sustained demonstration of the kind of behavior that would have prevented our current situation in the first place. If you can spend 1 year providing genuine, respectful care to elderly individuals while contributing to programs that prevent the kind of abuse you committed, I said, outlining the specific terms of what would essentially be a probationary period, then we can discuss what assistance might be appropriate for helping your family recover financially. Vanessa nodded slowly, clearly understanding that this proposal represented both an opportunity and a challenge that would require fundamental changes in her attitude and behavior rather than simply going through the motions of appearing reformed. "What about Daniel's job situation and our immediate financial needs?" she asked, demonstrating that she was still thinking practically about her family's survival, even as she contemplated the longer-term implications of accountability and change. "Your immediate needs will be met," I said, pulling out a folder that contained information about temporary assistance that would prevent further deterioration of their situation, while Vanessa demonstrated her commitment to genuine change. "I've arranged for housing assistance, utilities coverage, and basic living expenses for 1 year while you complete this program." The relief on her face was immediate and profound, as she realized that her family's crisis would be stabilized, even though full restoration would require sustained effort and demonstrated change on her part. "But I want to be clear about the conditions," I continued, ensuring that she understood the requirements and expectations that would govern any assistance. "This is not charity based on need, and it's not forgiveness that erases accountability. This is an opportunity to earn trust through action rather than words." Vanessa accepted the terms immediately, clearly understanding that this represented the only path forward that offered hope for both personal redemption and family recovery. More importantly, she seemed to grasp that the opportunity to work with abuse victims would provide education about the impact of her behavior that could prevent future harm to vulnerable individuals. 6 months later, I received reports from the program directors about Vanessa's work with elderly abuse victims, reports that indicated not only competent professional performance, but genuine emotional engagement with the people she was serving. She had apparently discovered that caring for vulnerable individuals with respect and dignity was actually more satisfying than exploiting their weaknesses for psychological gratification. More significantly, she had become an effective advocate for policy changes that would better protect elderly patients from abuse, using her own experience and professional expertise to identify vulnerabilities in the healthcare system that allowed harmful behavior to continue undetected and unpunished. Daniel found new employment with a firm that specialized in elder law, work that brought him into contact with families dealing with abuse and exploitation issues that gave him new understanding of the importance of protecting vulnerable populations. He never learned the full truth about his wife's behavior or my role in their financial crisis, but his new professional focus suggested that some lessons had been absorbed even without complete knowledge. Their children adapted to their new circumstances with the resilience that young people often display when faced with significant changes, and they seemed to benefit from the reduction in materialism and status consciousness that had characterized their previous lifestyle. Emma and Lucas developed closer relationships with their parents and a better understanding of the difference between needs and wants. Most importantly, Vanessa completed her year of service with genuine enthusiasm and requested permission to continue working with the Victim Assistance Fund on a permanent basis, indicating that her transformation from someone who exploited vulnerability to someone who protected it had become integral to her identity, rather than simply a condition for receiving assistance. After confirming with program supervisors that her commitment appeared genuine and sustainable, I authorized the full financial assistance that restored their economic security, while ensuring that their experience of vulnerability had taught lasting lessons about empathy and accountability. The final conversation I had with Vanessa about our relationship took place on the anniversary of the Scalding water incident, as she prepared to move out of the subsidized housing and into a modest home that represented genuine financial recovery earned through demonstrated change. "I understand now that real strength isn't about having power over vulnerable people," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom that comes from experiencing both sides of power dynamics. It's about using whatever power you have to protect people who can't protect themselves. I nodded, satisfied that the lesson had been learned completely and permanently. Justice had been served. Consequences had taught what punishment never could, and someone who had chosen cruelty had learned to choose compassion instead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.